And now please welcome warmly our keynote speaker, Erik Vollebregt, to give us the keynote speech on the newest updates on EU MDR. Hi, Erik.
Hi, Vivian. Thanks very much for having me. I thought briefly about introducing myself in Mandarin, but I think I would either offend people or making them laugh too much. So I decided against it. Let me share my screen. Sure. Here we go.
You can start sharing the screen and I will start to introduce you to our audience, okay?
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I'll stop sharing for the moment.
Talk, we are really in time and relax. Great. Now we come to Erik. Erik Vollebregt 是法学的硕士，医疗器械和体外诊断相关的欧盟和国家法律的和监管律师，是欧盟和荷兰层面的生命科学监管专家。他专注于监管建议、合同，针对当局的监管诉讼和收并购。那他为全球10大医疗技术公司中的绝大多数提供欧盟医疗器械和体外诊断法律法规、监管和战略方面的咨询。那 Erik 最初他是被培训为知识产权和竞争的律师，他的职业生涯起源于欧盟委员会竞争总司，随后他在三家大型的国际律师事务所获得了诉讼事务、商业合同和交易工作的经验。那 Erik 通过他在分支协会和为欧盟委员会提供咨询的专业委员会的成员资格，积极的为国家和欧盟层面的监管法律和政策的发展做出了很大的贡献。那 Erik 还是医疗设备相关的纠纷中的裁员，并在国外诉讼中被聘为专家证人。他是在欧盟层面非常有权威的监管律师。Okay, Erik, I'm done with your introduction. And we are really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Vivian. Then I will now timely share my screen and start the presentation. Here we go. Again, welcome everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar. Insights from a European MDR expert. I've been working with European medical devices law for more than 2 decades at the moment. I've been trained originally at the European Commission, and I've specialized in medical devices later. I work for the majority of the top 10 medical devices companies in the world and for the majority of MedTech Europe members as well. So I have a really good picture what is going on, you could say, in the European MDR. I also work for a number of Chinese companies, so I've also have kind of a perspective on inbound Chinese investments and also how Chinese companies are doing with their medical devices on the European market. So for the people that are new to the MDR, you could basically summarize it with this slide. It's the MDR was at the time introduced because there were several scandals with medical devices in Europe that had a very profound political backlash. The PIP breast implants scandal, and also the problems with metal hip implants. And it is very important to not underestimate how much this political outrage has formed the MDR as it is, and also how authorities can respond to non-compliance under the MDR. Sometimes I have clients that say, well, but we are just a little non-compliant under the rules. You have to understand that really these rules were put into place in a no more of this reflex. So that also means that this is also the way authorities look at it. They can be very almost disproportionate in the way they enforce rules, because they're very intent on never have something like this happening anymore. Another way to look at the MDR is to see it as an abbreviation for more data required. That is actually because there's such a strong focus on pre-market and post-market clinical data under the MDR. That means also that as a company, you do not only need to focus on design and development of the device as such, but you also need a very clear and thought out strategy around how am I going to basically collect performance data about the device throughout the whole life cycle of the device, so I can prove during the whole life cycle of the device that the device is safe and effective. Then another point is that the MDR introduces a lot of new things, like, for example, supply chain controls, clinical trial rules for medical devices are harmonized mostly at European level. And like I said, a very strong focus on clinical data collection throughout the lifetime of the device. These are all very procedural rules, you could say. So that also means that notified bodies will audit very severely on correct procedure on these points. Then, as some of the people that have companies with devices on the market in Europe may already have noticed, is that the transitional regime is very complex for the MDR. Reason for that is that basically the transitional regime as it was set up never really functioned. They made the policy choice that all the devices that were already approved under the directive needed to be re-certified under the MDR. All the notified bodies that had already been notified under the directive needed to be re-notified under the MDR, and the result was a situation that became so complex and such a bottleneck that they had to keep changing the transitional regime. The last change that they made was 20 March this year, where they again revised the transitional regime for so-called legacy devices, so devices that were already on the market under the directives. So what should you expect for the MDR in the future? Because of course, if you are looking at the European market, or you are already on the European market, as I've said, the transitional regime at the moment, it is still not working as it was intended as a result of, in my view, wrong policy choices. So they decided that all the devices and notified bodies needed to be readmitted, which turned out to be a really bad choice because it created an enormous bottleneck in the system, resulting in shortages of notified body capacity that are now actually hampering innovation, because the notified bodies are so busy recertifying all the old devices that they don't have have limited time to certify new devices that want to come to the market. And especially the small and medium-sized enterprises that Heiko discussed are having a very difficult time at the moment finding notified bodies willing to certify their devices. As a result, we have already had shortages in certain devices reported in Europe. And as I've said, they have tweaked the transitional regime a couple of times, but so far the issues have not been really solved. Basically, what everybody is now looking for is the benefits that will be brought about by a position paper issued by the European MDCG. That's basically the governing body of the member states that is responsible for rollout of the MDR. They have made this position paper in September last year with 19 so-called non-legislative measures that are supposed to make the difference in a more smooth implementation of the MDR. That's together with the 20 March amendments should solve all the problems. Well, seeing is believing, as my grandmother would always say. But this is for the audience very important pieces of legislation to understand. So look at the MDCG 2022-14 position paper and see which 19 measures they propose, and also make sure you understand the 20 March amendments. So what more to expect for the MDR in the future? Because of course, everybody is always looking ahead. And at the moment, some people still say to me like, oh, the MDR is new. And I'm like, what, new? How can you say that? Because like I said, I've been working in this industry for a long time. I was around in 2012 when the MDR was proposed as a new law. So that's already 11 years ago. It's in effect since 2017. It's applicable since 2 years ago. So it's really not that new anymore, you could say. And this is why the European Commission is already working on an information collection exercise to evaluate the MDR and the IVDR, the sister regulation of the MDR for IVDs. And by 2027, there is going to also be a formal review moment. Now, what I can also tell you is that the European MedTech branch associations and also national politicians are already pushing more and more for structural changes to the MDR, because now that we have the MDR in effect for some time, people are really finding out that certain things do not work that well, certain choices don't turn out that well, there is a quite fierce lobby that has started now for another thorough revision of the European medical devices regulation by fixing some of the root causes in the MDR. Like, for example, there is likely going to be a move towards more centralized responsibility. As Marta already explained, Europe is not a single place, it's more of a mosaic, and this is also true for the regulation. Although we have quite a lot of regulation that is harmonized at the European level, still the responsibility for the application is quite decentralized. So this is something that might be fixed in a next iteration. There are things where I would say Europe is very much behind, like, for example, on orphan medical devices. China, for example, I know has an orphan medical device benefits system. Japan has it, Brazil has it, the US has it. Who doesn't have it? Europe. So also there's a lot to be improved, and also access of small and medium-sized enterprises to the system is also one of the big complaints at the moment that might be remedied. So I would advise you not to be surprised if in a year or two we might see some quite radical revisions happening to the MDR. You can remember and think back to this moment that you heard it here for the first time. So what is specifically relevant for Chinese companies, of course, since I'm addressing a Chinese audience, also working for several Chinese medical devices companies. So what can I advise the Chinese manufacturers of medical devices? First of all, it is very important at the moment that you understand the transitional regime for the MDR and how to work with the 20 March 2023 amendment. Why? Because it is the system has changed so much that it's not really evident how it should work. Several things are important there. So understand the status of your legacy devices. Like, for example, has your legacy device certificate that might have expired, has that perhaps relived under the amendment, or is it still valid at the moment? One of the big misconceptions about the amendment is that manufacturers get more time. This is not the case. because under basically every scenario that you can make under the amendment, manufacturers will still need to file an MDR application well before 26 May 2024. So this is the kind of it, and filing such an application with a notified body is quite a process. So I advise companies to always take at least 7 months before for that whole process, which and that is 7 months is the process without the actual evaluation period by the notified body. To clarify that, so that's probably another year. So really, you need about 7 months for this whole notified body selection and onboarding process. So that means that if you want to be in the door with a notified body by 26 May next year, you need to have started this process, well, basically after the summer. And that's very soon, right? Basically, you would need to start in October at the very, very, very latest. So time is of the essence. Of course, you also need to have a plan B in case your MDR submission is not timely or unsuccessful. Remember, notified bodies, I have several notified bodies as clients as well. Notified bodies always complain about the very bad quality of submissions made by medical devices manufacturers, as a result of which these applications often get rejected. If your application is rejected, then you do not have a pending application anymore, and you cannot benefit from continued legacy device status. If you are going to rely on legacy device status of your device, this system to prove it is also not very clear. They took the not so smart policy choice, I think, of saying, well, but you can issue a self-declaration as a manufacturer, and you might ask a notified body for a letter confirming certain things. But this is nothing truly official. So that means that in other countries where you are going to have to rely on your CE mark being valid, for example, it will be hard to prove that the CE mark is actually valid. So also there you need to really work to understand this. You need to also understand the concept of significant change, because as was always the case, legacy devices can't be subject to the concept of significant change. This is something where I often see European companies that have Chinese OEMs or Chinese companies themselves really misunderstand the concept. They make all kinds of changes to software, for example, that they think are, oh, these are perfectly fine. And then they turn out to be significant changes. They don't understand why this is such a problem, but it does actually invalidate the legacy device status of your device. So very important to understand that well. I've already said that MDR is a very rule-oriented, rule-based system. So that means that formal compliance is very important at this moment. Experience with the MDR is limited. So that means that as a manufacturer or an OEM for a European company, it is very important to really stick to the procedures very clearly. Whenever I see fights, for example, break out between a European company and a Chinese OEM, it is usually about a European company claiming that the Chinese OEM made changes that they didn't tell them about, for example, or didn't sufficiently inform them, which changes impact the legacy device status because there might be a significant change. And that is, of course, an existential threat for the validity of the certificate. And then, of course, it can escalate into a dispute. Also, quality management system requirements are an important one, because the MDR has a lot of its own quality management system requirements that go beyond the ISO standard, which is often not really appreciated by companies. Also, make sure that you understand that. This is a flowchart I've made for application of the amendment. I'm not going to go in detail there because I only have 20 minutes. It's only 5 minutes left, and I know that Vivian is really strict on time, so I'm going to skip that over. take a look and see what you do with it. And otherwise, you can always ask me about it. So what is, in addition, interesting and relevant for Chinese manufacturers? What I see a lot is that Chinese manufacturers cluster their authorized representative mandates at specialized Chinese authorized representatives. This may look attractive, but in practice, it is not always a good idea. Why? Because these are typically the kind of authorized representatives that score high on the risk scoring of competent authorities, as we might find structural non-compliances there. And for example, I know that a Chinese specialized authorized representative in the Netherlands, for example, is currently being investigated by the competent authorities because they think like, oh, well, there are probably things here. And then they go look, and then a authorized representative has a specific way of working, which might not be completely compliant. And that then affects all of its clients. Right, so that is a reason why you might choose not to be with an authorized representative that specifically specializes in Chinese companies. My advice is always go to one that is already been in the market for years and really knows what authorities are looking for, rather than speaks your language. Because of course it's nice if they speak your language, but it's even nicer if they don't get you in trouble. Then supply chain controls, very important. When is somebody an importer? When is somebody a distributor? How should you work with them? Heiko refers to software, and this is also one where I would say I see a lot of issues happening there. Software design, very specific under the MDR, so have attention for that. Then there is one that I can't understate, more or less, and that is that if you have software, make sure that you do not focus only on the medical devices regulation, but also apply artificial intelligence and data-related EU regulation very well as well, because these are also regulations. If the device is non-compliant under those, then it is still illegal. You still can't place it on the market. So that's very important. The European artificial intelligence regulation still hasn't been approved, but it's moving towards approval. But the GDPR, the new European health data space regulation, for example, all these things have to do with data. And if you have devices running software, there will be data going through them. As Marta has said, understand European diversity. I think that was a fantastic point that she made. I cannot emphasize this enough. We have about 24 languages in the European Union, as many competent authorities as we have languages. So it's a complex patchwork of things. So even if there's one MDR, do not underestimate how much diversity is still underlying that. So Europe is definitely not a single place. Chinese distributors, supply chain regulation is important. Again, understand what is local regulatory competence, because the MDR allows local regulation of distributors to an extent still, but distributors are also regulated under the MDR. For investors, and that is basically the last slide, it is really important that you do good regulatory due diligence, because if your regulatory due diligence doesn't check out, then you may buy a company, but then in the end it turns out you may have bought some technology and some people, but you can't place your devices on the market. So what I always do, and I work for a number of private equity funds, is we always look first at, does a company have a good MDR transition plan? And is it realistic that it is implemented? Does the company have good GDPR and AI regulation, even for AI regulation ahead of time? Does it have good compliance on these points? Because otherwise, you basically buy a company that may have a problem with legacy device. For example, recently I saw a software company saying like, yes, we have software legacy device status and we are going to implement all these fantastic changes in the next 2 years. This is contradictory because these are likely significant changes. So if you see a company like that, that's a complete risk to buy. Also, make sure that you are aware of companies maybe possessing dual use technology, because there is additional legislation that can also cause acquisition problems there. So that's it. Thanks for your attention. I think exactly in 20 minutes. If you want to know more, I've written the book, you could say, on the medical devices regulation and the IVDR regulation. It's about 1,400 pages and there's everything in there you need to know. Look me up on LinkedIn, watch my blog, or contact me in any other way. And thank you for your attention. If there's any questions, then let's have them, Vivian.
Okay, really great. Thank you so much, Erik. And now I want to actually announce that we have already reached 1,397 audience from China watching our live event. Really great. Thank you so much, Erik, for sharing your vast experience in EU MDR, which is really a major concern. And also at the same time, I think it's a confusion for Chinese medtech companies that are interested in enter the European market. So actually many questions here. Maybe I can ask you 2 short questions because we are
Sure.
really advanced in our timeline. And first, I see really you mentioned this point, really interesting for our Chinese companies to pay attention, not to point clustered Chinese authorized representative. I think this is really important point. Could you please elaborate on that? That's the first question. And the second question, I just saw that Michael just called in, and maybe second question is on due diligence for Chinese investors and buyers. How could they ensure that the regulatory pathway or the path provided by the underlying investment is enforceable, other than by consulting you, of course? Good.
Yes, thanks for these 2 questions. First, the one on the Chinese authorized representative. So what happens is that what I often see is that authorized representatives are much regulated in a lot more detail under the MDR, but they are not regulated in ultimate detail. What is important is that the authorities expect authorized representatives to be a lot more independent from the manufacturer than they were under the MDR. And also authorized representatives are supposed to be critical and really check compliance of the manufacturers as well. My experience is that where you get these, let's say, specialized authorized representatives, they tend to have their own, let's say, more informal procedures with manufacturers, and that also works for authorized representatives from other areas of the world. You see them that specifically cater to Japanese, that specifically cater to South Americans. And the problem is that when you get a lot of, let's say, uniformity in an authorized representative, that it's very easy for an authorized representative to treat everybody in the same way, which might not be the way that the authorities would want to see it. So the problem is then that if that way turns out to be non-compliant, it affects all of their customers. And my experience with authorized representatives that do not specify in a particular demography of manufacturers, that they have a much more robust compliance culture, and also competent authorities will not look at them in a way like, hey, there may be something going on here, because authorities always look in terms of risks, right? So they will always look at why are all these manufacturers clustering together at this authorized representative? This is a signal. It's a bit like when you have when you are looking at the highway with your surveillance cameras, and you have a lot of cars in one place, something is going on. So this is also how the authorities look at this, and they're often prone to go check out these authorized representatives quicker because they think like, okay, or it might even be curiosity where they think like, hey, but why are all these Chinese companies at this authorized representative? There may be something going on that we want to know about. And they are less likely to do that with authorized representatives that have a much more heterogeneous composition of clients. So it's not a discrimination issue, I would say, because that's of course easy to think, but rather they see it as if a lot of people with the same profile are clustering there, then something interesting is happening that we want to know about, or maybe should know about. That's how they see this. Then with M&A, so how can you ensure that the company that you are looking at to buy that is compliant? First of all, what I would do is if you are to make the distinction between if you are not already active on the European markets and you don't know a lot about the MDR as a company. So, for example, if you already have a good regulatory team that is managing your presence on the European market, listen to them. Because what I always see is that in these acquisitions, management will have their spreadsheets, and the spreadsheets will say something about the company, and they will say, oh, this is an interesting company to buy. Their technology is interesting, their product is interesting, and we expect that they will make huge profits for years to come. But then they forget that you can only make huge profits if your licenses are actually in order. So, and this is usually where it goes wrong, because they don't give enough attention to that. I've been in situations where actually I said, look, hey, there's red flags. They say this and that, and it's not possible because look at the law, it's not possible. And then they would just tell me to shut up, buy the company anyway, and then a few months later, you would see the company collapse because exactly what I warned about happened. So my advice would be to listen to the regulatory people as well in the transaction. These people are often listened to maybe a bit in the beginning, but then they are ignored later because management says, okay, well, these nerds can now shut up. We want to buy this company. And then they forget that, yeah, it's a bit like you go buy a car, right? You try it out, you see if it works. Maybe you ask an expert to take a look at the car and say, well, maybe you read out the computer to see if the car has had any collisions and so on. Yeah, so why wouldn't you do that with a company? And also take enough time for the process. Very important too. Usually you have these M&A transactions that need to happen in very short timelines. That's usually too short to do a good regulatory due diligence, because the tactics of these companies that want to sell themselves is always they know management of the buyer wants to buy them anyway. So if they are as difficult and unforthcoming as possible with information, especially when it gets a bit tricky, then you can really see that people on the other side are instructed to just sit on the information until management has bought the company. I could talk about that for a long time, but I'm not sure, Vivian, if we have time for that.
Okay, great. Now we have really reached 3 o'clock in Switzerland, and really great. Thank you so much, Erik. And I really recommend people read the ebook and follow the